Hello and welcome to Mr. Manley History Teacher's video on how to answer the Germany 12-mark essay question in the AQA Germany 1890 until 1945 assessment paper. Now, this is a question that will appear as question number 6 in the assessment paper, so it could potentially be the last question that you answer, although some students do actually find it easier to answer this question first, as it is worth the most marks in the Germany 1890 to 1945 assessment paper, and so you can do the questions in the order that suits you best. So let's get started then. So here's an example of a 12-mark question that will appear like this in your summer assessment. Now, this question is as follows. The example we're using here: which of the following was the more important reason for the increased support for the Nazis before 1933? And then you're given two options or two prompts. Here we've got the first prompt is Nazi propaganda, and the second prompt is the Great Depression. And then it says explain, that's a key word here, explain your answer with reference to both bullet points. Now, students at my school completed this question, and some of the common mistakes that were committed by students when answering this type of question were as follows. So some students were too generalized with their analysis, so they didn't really develop in much detail exactly how each bullet point that was given to them led to or let the Nazis gain more support. The second common mistake was being too vague with details. For example, not outlining what the Nazi propaganda messages and methods were, but just sort of stating that Nazi propaganda increased support for Hitler, without expanding on much more detail about how the propaganda led to increased support for Hitler. Some students focus too heavily on just one bullet point. Don't forget, it says in the question, explain your answer with reference to both, not one, but both bullet points. You need to make sure you refer to both bullet points in your answer. Now, the best answers, we'll come on to speak about that in more detail in a bit as well, but the best answers will provide a clear line of argument or a clear judgment throughout the answer. But some students didn't provide a clear judgment about which was the more important reason, even in their conclusion. So it's really important you give a clear judgment at the end, definitely, and the best answers will have clear lines of argument throughout of which reason is the most important reason for whatever it is you're being asked about. So here it's increased support for the Nazis before 1933. And finally, referring to material from outside the time period, you must include information and evidence from the time period in question. Because if you include evidence from outside the time period in question, for example, for this question, after 1933, you won't gain any marks for that. So you need to make sure you stick to the time period in question when giving evidence in your answer. So how should you structure this answer? Well, first of all, you don't really need to write an introduction for this answer that you might do for a 16-mark question in the conflict and tension, and even the Elizabeth historic environment question. You might write a brief introduction. You don't need to do that for this type of question. You can just go straight into writing about each of the prompts that you're given. So you should start off by writing about either the bullet points, okay, so paragraph of the first bullet point or second bullet point first of all, and why it should be considered important to a certain extent. Now, you can decide to what extent you think this bullet point was important. You can say it was quite important, very important, not particularly important. It doesn't really matter, as long as you're able to justify with evidence why you think that factor was important to whatever extent you decide. Then what you need to do is then you need to go on to your second bullet points. So if you did the second one first, you then need to go back and do the first one, or vice versa. If you've done the first one first, do the second bullet point next. And you need to again explain with evidence why you think that factor was important to a certain extent. Once you've written about both factors, you should be looking to write quite sizable paragraphs for each one, with lots of detail, lots of evidence, and lots of justification behind why you think each was important to an extent. You then need your conclusions. So you need to give a judgment as to which you think was more important. And like I've just said here, don't sit on the fence. Don't say that they're both equally important. You won't gain as many marks if you do that. So for the question that we looked at earlier, the example question, we won't spend too long at what you potentially say in answering this question. If you want to, you can have a go at answering this question yourself as some exam preparation. But here's what you could have said with regards to Nazi propaganda. So you want to be really specific when you're using examples and evidence of this type of question. So you might mention election posters, speeches by Hitler, marches and rallies. You might even want to mention the Nuremberg rallies and national campaigns such as Hitler over Germany, where basically Hitler flew all around Germany giving speeches in the build-up to elections in the early 1930s. You might want to mention the types of messages the Nazis focused on, for example, the anti-Semitic messages or fear of communism. Nazi propaganda also took advantage of the weak response by the Weimar governments to the Great Depression. So the Nazis promised in their slogans and in their posters work and bread to the German people. And these messages appealed to a large range and a broad spectrum of German people, like the middle classes, and also industrialists and wealthy Germans as well. Not particularly to the working classes, although some did support the Nazis as well. When it came to the Great Depression, you might want to mention about the fact that 6 million Germans became unemployed as a result. You might want to reference the fact there was political chaos. Oh, that's a bit too dark. We'll rub that out. You might want to mention the fact there was political chaos. So the president was already using presidential decrees, which basically undermined democracy in the Weimar Republic. And then a desperation at the failure of German democracy. And many Germans turned to extremist parties like the Nazis, but also the communists as well, to solve problems. You might want to also reference the fact that before the Depression, the Nazis had only ever been a fringe party, so they weren't really that popular. However, the Great Depression changed that completely, and the Nazis were able to capitalize on this and gain lots more support. Finally, we're just going to look at this student mark scheme, which outlines what you need to do to get the best possible marks. So if you write an answer that includes just basic knowledge and an explanation of one or both bullet points, you're only going to get between 1 and 3 marks. You're not going to score any higher than that. If you use some specific knowledge and you give simple explanations for both bullet points, you're likely to get 4 to 6 marks. If you start to give a more developed explanation of both bullet points, so the highest mark you can get if you only reference one bullet point or one factor is 6 marks. But if you give a developed explanation of both bullet points supported with some factual detailed evidence, you can get between 7 to 9 marks. And this is what you need to do to achieve the top marks. You need to use accurate and detailed knowledge for both bullet points. Again, so you can't just refer to one bullet point, you need to refer to both. And throughout your answer, and this is absolutely vital for this type of question, there's a clear and sustained judgment. And the best answers won't just have judgments, like I mentioned earlier in the video, left to the conclusion, but they'll have judgments that are consistent throughout. So the person marking your answer knows exactly which type of factor you think was more important in causing something to happen. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and I hope you watch more of my videos again soon.